organizations in the US are more supportive of nuclear than people who are not members or supporters of those organizations. So those two blue bars adding to 65% for members and whatever that is, 62% for non-members, 61% for non-members, are significantly more supportive. Now, you also notice on the right of that chart, you could give you a headline the other way, if I were so minded, that says that environmentalists also reject nuclear more than non-environmentalists. That black 9% is bigger than 7, 10 is bigger than 9. It's true, but they do it by less. So overall, the bigger effect is still that. And that basically just says people who are member environmentalists more than people who aren't. So that yellow, don't really know how to think in the middle, is much smaller for environmentalists. So that's part of the effect, but it's not a symmetrical effect. The growth is bigger in the support than in the rejection, in the opposition. I can go back on any of these. That I know there's a lot to digest in some of these. We also looked at gender. I think it's quite well known that support for nuclear skews male, and that's indeed what we found. You can see on the left in particular much higher levels of support, of agreeing with this same old statement among male and female. But what's interesting about that is that the big difference is not in the disagree, the big difference is in the yellow bit in the middle again. So that gender difference in support really reflects much greater neutrality among women rather than rejection among women. The actual rejection is not much bigger. It's a little bit bigger, but it's not much bigger. The big difference among women is the neutrality rather than the rejection. Also interesting to see in Virginia, again, being a bit cautious of the sample size, that the gender skew is not as big as it seems to be in the US overall. I got 10 of these, I think, just to give you an idea, so I'm halfway through sharing these, and then we can dig into, I've seen questions appearing in the thing faster than I can read them, so we can go back into those in a minute. Also looking at age demographics, so we looked at this in a different way. This is about strong rejection, so the serious opposition, the size of that black bar in the charts that we've just been looking at. How does the size of that black bar in each country differ by age group? And I think what's interesting about this is that even in the countries with significant levels of nuclear rejection, which is to say Germany and Japan, the blue and yellow lines at the top, the only real step up, the only real high level in rejection comes among the older age groups. So even in Germany and Japan, when you look in the 18 to 34s, there is no country where that black bar is more than 8% of the population. And Virginia sitting in the middle. Again, with no big age difference across Virginia or indeed in the US. They're both pretty flat. You get the same effect, by the way, as I was talking about with gender, that as you get older, you know what you think more on this topic, and so you can sort of, if you're not careful, you can make this, tell the story both ways around. But the net effect of this is, when you look at that strong rejection, it's really not a very big effect in most countries. A lot to digest if you wanted to read the words on this, but the general pattern is not very difficult to read, which is that nuclear support really transcends politics in most countries. So what you've got here is supporters of different political parties in each country, and what percentage of each party's supporters agree with that statement that you've seen in most of the other slides about supporting advanced nuclear. And the dark blue bars are where there's a majority support majority support for nuclear among supporters of each of the party, and the light blue is where it doesn't hit that 50% mark. So in most cases, they are the sort of relatively small, relatively left or green party in Sweden and in Germany. The sort of two substantial parties in there are the Social Democrats in Germany and the CDP in Japan, which are kind of mainstream parties that don't hit the 50% mark in those two countries. But actually, in most of the other countries, including most of the European countries, you can see even the supporters of the Green parties are net positive for nuclear, and in the US you can see how evenly its support is across Republican, Democrat, and Independent. And just drilling into the US, again, here's that picture that was on the top left of the previous chart, but reproduced with Virginia next to it. Compared to the US NatRep, it's pretty similar in Virginia. Having said that support is really non-partisan and even across parties, which is true across countries and pretty interesting. Actually, the motivation for what that support is not quite as even and uniform as those previous charts might expect. So in this one, we've asked people, this is US data, US national rep, so not just Virginia, but all of US. We've asked people at the bottom along the x-axis to identify where they are on a spectrum from very liberal to very conservative, and we've shown them a bunch of narratives about why they might support advanced nuclear, and we've given them an option to say choose which of these is the reason why you might support it, and they have the option of choosing the black one at the top, which is I wouldn't support it, I wouldn't choose any of those, but you might support advanced nuclear for reasons of energy independence, I'm reading from the bottom, or about American innovation, or about stopping climate change, or about to preserve our country's precious land, rather than letting it all go under solar and wind, to sustain our quality of life, and be a sort of narrative around opportunity and a sort of forward-looking technology story to allow us to continue to prosper and do everything we want. It might be about keeping jobs and money in our communities. We gave them all of those options, and you can see the proportion that chose each of those options for each of the different political groups. And I think what I find interesting on this is the asymmetry in particular of the yellow one, which is not that surprising in the US, that the climate change, is a much stronger argument on the left than it is on the right. No great surprise there. But what's interesting is that the American innovation and making our own energy independently, there's a little bit of skew to sort of balance that out overall, but they are actually arguments that work across both. So there are some arguments that work more politically aligned and some that are more evenly across. It's the asymmetry of this, that the fact that climate change skews one way, but the other arguments don't skew nearly as much the other way. So very small yellow on the right of the chart, but quite substantial blue on the left. And therefore, when we put that together, we look at this is a result of what we did as one of these randomized control trials. So we gave people a short narrative where they only saw one of them right at the beginning. Before they saw anything else, they saw one narrative. It might have been a narrative about energy independence, or one about clean innovation, or one about climate goals, and so on. Each person only saw one, and some people saw none. And then we looked at what's the difference in support depending on what narrative you saw. So if you saw none to begin with, your narrative support started at where it says control group at the bottom at 52.7%, but there were substantial lifts in levels of support for some of these narratives. There was some support for all of them, but in particular the clean innovation and energy independence narratives are the ones that gave substantial uplift in how people think about nuclear. So that was sort of 10 highlights from this. We've got lots more. We did a whole sort of segmentation for looking at how different parts of the market see it, if you like to think of it as a market, using that sort of brand and marketing discipline that we bring to it. We looked at reaction to different types of names and whether the nuclear name is tainted or not tainted, to which the answer is no, it's not tainted. There was no need to worry about the nuclear name. So lots more in the report, but that's a summary. If you can, I don't have a sort of handy, just be able to read out a URL that's easy to do, so maybe it needs to be shared electronically afterwards. If you're somewhere where you can see the screen, there's a QR code for the report. The URL underneath it is probably, if you can't see the QR code, you probably can't see the URL either, but maybe I can put it in the chat in a bit or something like that. But anyway, we have it. There is a full written report available.
Simon, thank you so much for that. Having seen various parts of this presentation, but not the Virginia specific piece, that's very interesting and really helpful. And we will, for folks on the WebEx, and then also on the Authority, we'll make sure we can get the link to the report around to the whole group. We have a little bit of time, so I would like to open it up. And before we open it up to questions, I do want to just remind, especially for everyone on the WebEx, that there is a formal time period at the end of the meeting that is set up that will allow for public comment, but the content during the meeting, this is really reserved for dialogue between our speakers and the authority members. So I know there's some questions in the chat or some comments, and kind of there ones from the authority, we can address those and have a dialogue with Simon. Otherwise, we'll make sure we address any questions or comments from the public during that formal period of the. So I think I saw Glenn had a question. Was there any other from the chat? But Glenn, if you want to ask your question of Simon and any other authority members, if you have questions on the WebEx or in the room.
Sure, no, I appreciate it. Just two quick questions. One was, if N was only 220, what's the margin of error for Virginia's numbers on that study?
So we'd have to look at that for. I mean, 220 is small. 220, as I said at the introduction, is not what we were designing the study for when we went in to do it. It was a sort of, oh, that's convenient. Because we did 13,000, we basically designed it so that we'd have 700 people per cell for the randomized control trial. That was the sort of what was driving our numbers. And then it was a fortuitous thing that says, oh, we should be able to give you some directionally interesting answers because we've got, a useful sample in Virginia. So you kind of need to look at that question by question because it's messy in terms of how big the differences were. I think what we're really showing with and in particular, I think 220, when we're giving you an answer of how something is for the whole of Virginia, is not bad for the is meaningful, is useful for the sort of results that we're presenting. When you start splitting that up into groups, when you do the age one that says, oh, let's look at those 3 different age groups and how do they compare so that each one is at best a third of 220, and you're doing differences between them, then you're kind of scraping at the limits of what you should probably do.
And the last question, I know you had a question on there that said that should your locality utilize nuclear technology, and I'm wondering did you ask a question more specific of, would it be okay, or how do you feel, or would you support a nuclear reactor in your county or city? Because I'm wondering, a city using nuclear technology just means I'm bringing in electrons from a nuclear plant that could be, cities away. Do you think we can correlate that to whether they support a nuclear reactor in their city, or do you think that needs to be a separate question?
It's what we were trying to imply. We were trying not to use the reactor word because some of what we were trying to do was explore, are we kind of making life more difficult for ourselves when we use scary words? Indeed, is nuclear a scary word? And we discovered it wasn't because we tested alternatives and nuclear tested well. But that's the reason why we use slightly peculiar technology rather than saying reactor, because reactors is one of those words. Do you want radioactivity down your street is a sort of loaded question. And so that's why we were trying to say, would you be okay if your local electricity company, use it? So we were trying to imply the localness of bringing it there. We were trying to describe a reactor in the neighborhood, but without using the reactor word. And that's why we also tested different naming. When we did test different naming, by the way, nuclear tested absolutely fine. Small modular reactor tested worst of all the names that we tested. So, and that's probably not really about being small and modular, it's probably the other bit.
Thank you.
Scott. Yeah, thanks, Tom. Simon, thank you. Scott Cobble, two questions. Top of your briefing, you began touched on the subject of advanced versus, I'll say, existing. So I'm curious, when you dug into that, you asked a specific question on how we feel, again, new versus existing, and something you asked that in some way, and then how that might correlate with policy making, as we've seen in the past, where they've been treated differently, well, particularly at the federal level, maybe until recently, with tax credits and those kinds of things. Sunset provisions, what counts, what doesn't count, those sort of economic incentives that more state that might be able to offer. So, curious if you asked a question or questions similar to my question I'm throwing at you. So I thought you said something at the top.
So, we did it the way that we did it because the sort of thought was, is the advent of a new generation of nuclear technologies an opportunity to kind of position the industry differently, to treat it as a sort of big product launch moment? Is this like sort of the difference between traditional cell phones and an iPhone, and a sort of opportunity to reposition it? And that was some of the thinking around it. So that's why we used language like the latest nuclear technologies. We didn't get into, here's the difference between an old nuclear and new nuclear. We didn't sort of define what an SMR was. We didn't distinguish between SMR and AMR and all those things that we now get questioned about. And that was sort of deliberate because that's not really something that the public, I think, gets its head around. But we were sort of trying to say, if you thought of nuclear in the context of something that was current and new technology and innovative and looking forward, as opposed to any image that you might or might not have of nuclear, which I'll now offend you all about, of sort of grey 1960s dials and control rooms, then does that help change how we think about it? So we weren't really trying to test a sort of defined generation. We were just trying to sort of position nuclear in that context of something that has new generations, new solutions, and new technologies that are being innovated now, rather than however else people might think about it. But we were also trying. There's a balance because there's that opportunity, but we were exactly not trying to sort of draw a line between that generation and sort of one's good and one's not good or anything like that. I know it's a slightly fuzzy answer to your question, but I think that's because the answer is slightly fuzzy.
It's fair. Your study is what it is, and I appreciate your answer. I get where you're coming from. Second question really was on timing, and you said this on the top, forgive me, because I noticed in a couple of the slides where in the international comparing countries, Poland was like, I think 92, and the next country was 82 in terms of all countries. Curious the time, maybe you've seen it in previous studies, how sort of world events might shape people's views, considering Poland, Russian gas, Ukraine, everything going on really this period of February. Again, so like a 10-point difference. There were a few other slides too where it was sprinkled in a slightly, say, more positive outlook than the next nearest country.
So the easy answer is when the timing was, which was the back end of last year's and spilling over into the beginning of this year. So definitely, within the Ukraine war, well within the Ukraine war period, and not right at the beginning of it. I mean, it's interesting because you see both effects coming out of the news flow. One is obviously, particularly in Poland, the sort of the vulnerability and need for clean energy, but actually in Poland's mostly a transition from coal, not a transition from gas. And so you might expect that to be influencing it more in Germany, that's most exposed to the sort of Russian gas problem. A lot of the transition going on in Poland is a coal to nuclear transition, and they have their own coal. So actually, in terms of energy security, they're happy with coal. There's all the other issues with coal, but it's not really an energy security issue so much in Poland. So I don't know that that would be driving it quite so much. And then, of course, you also get headlines in the newspapers all about whether Russians are about to blow up Ukrainian nuclear power stations. So they've been it's sort of added to the negative publicity about nuclear as well, because of sort of military risks to the power stations that happens in the press in Europe. I don't know how much it is there. So I can only speculate because I don't have a like for like comparison. We didn't do a similar survey before the Ukraine war. But those are some of the reasons for thinking that it's not. I mean, I'm sure it affects it. It may go on affecting it though. So it may be just sort of this is the new way. So I don't really have a benchmark from beforehand to compare it with. But that is the timing, and I think it's not obvious that would drive a sort of big skew in Poland.
Thank you.
Did you actually specify the other options: wind, solar, water, fossil fuel?
No, so we talked about whether or not you supported the use of nuclear alongside, I can't remember how we put it, but alongside other energy sources in the statement. But we didn't we didn't want to get into the sort of do you prefer nuclear to the or sort of there was quite a lot of guidance from interviews we did with the industry, so it wasn't to a question in the chat, it wasn't sponsored by the industry, but we did talk to people from the industry and from academics and from other places first, just to try and make sure that we could get our narratives and language as relevant as possible and as salient as possible, and build on whatever had already been learned. And in that there was quite a lot of, wariness about being seen to position nuclear against renewables, because it's not positioned against renewables, it's complementing renewables. And so that was how we asked the question. That's why we had alongside other energy sources in the question.
Other questions?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well on the WebEx.
Sorry. What was the numbers for the band report, and how did you guys get over to?
The numbers for?
Japan. Yeah.
Oh, for Japan. So Japan, I could just show you again. 1 second. So Japan in this measure, which also has that question that we were just talking about at the top, support the use of the latest nuclear energy technologies to generate electricity alongside other energy sources. Japan, so it's just under 50% support on this measure. It's the only one that doesn't hit the 50% support, but that's because it's also the one with the biggest neutral yellow bar. So even though the support level on this, the two blue bars put together don't quite hit 50%, the support is substantially bigger than the opposition. That's that 1.6 to 1 ratio on the right. That's on that question. And then the other one that I think is interesting for Japan is this one where we did the come off the fence question. You've seen everything about nuclear, you've seen the pluses, you've seen the minuses, and then we asked you the black and white question without anywhere to go in that yellow bit that says, do you believe that advanced nuclear should be an important part of the solution to our energy challenges? And there, 65% of Japan, less than anywhere else, but still 65%, 2/3 of people say yes when they have to say yes or no.
Hey Simon, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, first of all, I just want to say thank you because I think folks that compile these kinds of data sets often get hammered with lots of follow-up questions, but I just appreciate you all doing this and on the global scale. And second, I guess the question is, if you were in our shoes, how do you see us best utilizing this information, in what ways? And then if there was a follow-up study where we dug in more specifically to Virginia and gathered a larger sample size, based on what you learned, what might you want to dig into more?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I fully know what your shoes are, but so I think that one of the thoughts that we had behind doing this study was, is nuclear badly misunderstood? Should we, are we sort of missing an opportunity, depending on who we are, to talk about it differently? As I've said before, is nuclear a bad name, etc., etc. I think overwhelmingly what we found in this study is that actually it's not about repositioning it or calling it something else or what have you. I think there were some findings that we found around particularly the sort of new nuclear SMR story, where, as I said, small modular reactor was the sort of least good word, where we also tested various iconography, and the image of cooling towers is the least good image of any of the iconography that we used. So when everybody talks about SMRs and keeps showing pictures of cooling towers, you're not doing yourselves any favour. Nobody knows what that stuff coming out of the top of a cooling tower is, and it looks worse than it is. And in general, I would say that a lot of the sort of style of communication is quite technology oriented, and not surprisingly, a lot of the SMR companies are tech companies and see themselves as tech companies, and that's sort of what they are for attracting talent and all the rest of it. But actually, in terms of some of the imagery and language and things that we tested and narratives that we tested, anything that makes it a bit more down to earth, a bit more human, a bit more just straightforward and neighborly, rather than this sort of exotic tech image, is much more helpful in getting it. In getting a positive reception to it. So I think that was one of the insights we found. That's not about your question about guiding research, but it is about what to take from it. What else was I going to say? Then we also found we were guided when we wrote these narratives of sort of don't talk about safety. Nobody talks about safety. Airlines don't talk about safety. Safe things don't talk about safety. And so we didn't put safety or waste in any of those narratives. But then we did find in some of the questions that we asked about nuclear that they actually came out quite interesting and discriminating. And so then we thought, well, that's interesting. We're not really testing something that we wanted to test. So we wrote an additional narrative. We'd already done the US by this stage, but we put it in for the other countries. We wrote an additional narrative that we put in at the end of the survey that said, let me just tell you something about safety and waste. And it had stats about safety and the stats that you all know about, deaths per terawatt hour and so on of nuclear being much lower than other energy sources, and just how small and contained the nuclear fuel is, and how it's solid, and how a life's worth of energy fits in a can of soda, and some of those sort of statistics. We put that in a narrative, and we said, how do you respond to that narrative, where people had a question of, did you already know that? Is that new? Is it surprising? Or, do you still not believe it even now we've told you? And, there is a core group of rejectors and opponents that are quite consistent. And if you look into the full report, we kind of analyse who they are, where they come from, and how they sit. But they're about 15% of the population across our 8 countries. They're not zero, but they're a minority in all countries. And that's the same group that said, you can tell me all of that, but I still don't believe you. But they are, and they won't believe you, and they didn't respond to any of our narratives, and they had no uplift in the randomized control trial, and so on. And there is a group that is very resilient like that. But for most people, even among the nuclear supporters, most people said that, I didn't know that. And most people were in the I didn't know that, but that's kind of interesting bucket. So there are some things there, and I'm not saying I would sort of lead and campaign around safety, but I would not be shy about it in the way that the industry is shy about it. I think if you're shy about it and sort of shy about the nuclear name and shy about everything, there's a sort of indication of a concern. And I think actually the biggest thing that I took from this is is the sort of confidence to be able to talk about some of these things, because you're not talking to that small group, you're talking to the majority of the population, and for the majority of the population, they're actually quite open-minded. You saw the size of those yellow bars that were in the middle on several of these charts. They're quite open-minded, they're not anti, and they are actually receptive to even some of those sort of gritty messages around safety and waste and things like that.
Thank you, that's really helpful.
Simon, thank you so much for joining us. This was really helpful and really interesting work, and we will get the link out to the full report to the group. Very much appreciate you taking some time and joining us here today and walking us through this thing. So thank you again.
Thanks again for having us. Bye.
Okay, so next up we've got Will Payne from the Energy Delta Labs, just for an update on the activity down in Southwest. Will, turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everybody.